Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my book review of the book Lord of a Shattered Land by Howard Andrew Jones. It is the first book in the Chronicles of Hanuvar, or Hanuvar. I'm going to say Hanuvar. This is, as I said, the first book. It's a debut in this series. It is from the publisher Baen Books, and Baen did send me this copy ahead of release date, so I would like to thank Baen Books for that. They sent me the copy in exchange for an honest review, which is what I'll be presenting to you today. This book actually releases today for in hardcover and in ebook, and I'm just gotta say, I've been reading a lot of Baen books recently, particularly in the fantasy and sci-fi genres. Science fiction, they have like a really good, solid crop of science fiction writers, and I've been enjoying the fantasy stuff as well, but they haven't had a fantasy book or series that has particularly stood out to me as leaps and bounds above the other fantasy publishers, and this is the first one that really just, is in another league of its own, because it's just a fantastic read. This is the basic pitch of the book is it is rooted in history, in the Rome and Carthage type lands. It very much takes the ideas of the Roman-Carthage wars that were fought and places them in this fantasy setting, and you have this main character Hanuvar is the general of the kind of Carthage type land. He's the Hannibal stand-in, and his army is decimated, and he is basically lost at sea afterwards. And at the beginning of the book, he is trying to go back and try to rescue all of his people, who the remnants of his people are now all slaves back in the land that's the stand-in for Rome. And so in this book, you're following these chapters that are basically short stories where you're seeing him trying to go rescue more people and slowly move to his objective of founding a new land for his people. And in just about every single way, this book is delightful. In one sense, you have, as I mentioned, it's very much like the chapters are like short stories. It's very, as the author put it, episodic. Each individual story is very self-contained, but still advances the overall story, and you can see how he's slowly building his land, he's slowly rescuing his people, he's moving, you can see his progress in the map of the book, where you see his progress moving towards the enemy capital. And in this book, he's not only trying to rescue his people, but he's specifically trying to rescue his daughter, the last of his line of descendants. And it just really worked for me. The short story nature of it really felt like the Conan stories by Robert E. Howard. Very felt inspired by that. In fact, the cover feels inspired by the Conan books that you would find. I know Robert E. Howard was from the early 1900s, but in the mid-late 1900s, they had Conan stories over at Tor Books, and this really reminds me of those types of covers. And in each chapter, in each short story, basically, in this book, you see a new magical creature, a fantastical or even horrific creature that has some relevance to the plot. And it was very interesting the way the author was able to organically include all of these creatures into the story, and as such, that's what gives it the fantastical element. Otherwise, this book would truly be like a historical narrative that's just set in another world. There aren't like magic systems like you would read in a Brandon Sanderson novel, and there's not magical weapons. There's not magical things like you would read in the Shannara series by Terry Brooks. There's just the magical creatures, and then you're in the magical land. But it really is just more like a historical fiction set in another world, which I actually really like because the book doesn't get bogged down in the magic systems. It's nice just to have a book where the character, the plot, and the world building are the focus. And of course, the world building I think is great. It's very much, as I mentioned, modeled after the Rome-Carthage conflict, but there's also some elements of other fantasy storytelling in there. And the plot, the plot is pitched basically as like a revenge / rescue plot. He is trying to get revenge for this one land, basically decimating his land, while at the same time trying to rescue his people, specifically his daughter. But there is something really interesting where the author dives into the ideas of redemption and forgiveness. There is someone who does something terrible before the book starts, and you catch up to them at the point in the book, and they are so remorseful for what they did. And you follow Hanuvar as he decides, as he's going through killing the centurions and the generals of the other land, he all of a sudden decides not to harm this man and to let him live because he's forgiving the man, because the man's remorseful for what he did to Hanuvar. And I thought that was a genius story. There's a chapter in here that reminds me of like the gladiators type storytelling that's really fun. So you get to dip into some gladiator storytelling and then you jump out. And then you dip into a scene that reminds me, there's a scene in here that reminds me of the forest scene in The Princess Bride, and then you just jump out really quick. You're getting these short chapters. I should say, the chapters themselves are pretty long. Usually the chapters are between 20 and 50 pages, which sounds like a lot, but there's only 14 chapters, and if you read them like short stories, not like chapters, I think that it'll work a little bit better for you. And even some of the short stories, if you have to put it down, there are, in between, you can't do 50 pages at once. There are natural breaking points in the chapter that you could use. I really liked a lot of the themes, as I mentioned. I also really liked the way you were able to easily visualize where the characters are going. In the map, you not only have the map of the land, you also have a dotted line that represents the journey that he takes, and so you can follow that, and so with each chapter you see the main character slowly getting through that. And our main character, Hanuvar, is the main point of the story. I mean, it's literally called the Chronicles of Hanuvar. However, he is not a character that you necessarily are in the mind of often. In fact, almost the entirety of the book is written from another character's perspective. There's a character that you meet partway through the book named Antares, and Antares is a character who is basically an actor who ends up chronicling the life of Hanuvar and traveling along with him. And he serves as a good foil because Antares is a little bit more talkative, and Antares is a little bit more open about things, and is constantly asking Hanuvar questions to try to get Hanuvar to come out of his shell. And Hanuvar is obviously not wanting to do that on a normal basis because he's a very private person. And I really liked that because you don't dwell too much on his feelings, and yet you get a ton of understanding about the feelings that he's dealing with having his whole people basically wiped out almost, except for just a few thousand who are in slavery now. Some of the ways that our characters are able to escape the clutches of death are very interesting, and you would expect that this book has a more risque element to it, depending on some of the elements in this cover art. However, the book is not really that way. The characters dress in the way that people from that era would have dressed, and even from some more tribal type peoples would dress. But it's not really overtly sexual in any way. Obviously, several of the female characters in this book are very interested in their main male character. They're very interested in Hanuvar. And he has, for being a man who's supposed to be an older man, he's supposed to have grown daughters who are in their 20s, so I believe he's supposed to be at least 50s, maybe 40s, but he's not the youngest of guys, and yet for some reason, like, every woman he comes into contact with is kind of interested in him. But the author, which is an older type trope, but the thing I appreciated was the author never made anything explicit. He never made anything too graphic, which I really appreciate, because whenever I read that in books, it makes me frustrated because I have the moral quandary of my worldview stuff. And so it was really nice having a very appropriate book generally. And there's some swearing in the book, but there's not a ton of swearing. It's a very appropriate book as a whole. So, I mean, in just about every way, I just about loved everything in the book. There were a few things that I think were weak. I think a handful of the chapters could have either been cut or moved to another piece of work so that this was a little bit more tightly storied. But that's, whenever you have a short story collection, you're bound to have certain stories that work better for you. And this is not a short story collection per se, but it's just because of the nature of it. There are some chapters that just don't work as well as the others. And then Another problem I had was that there are footnotes occasionally, and the book's written like a historical record, and so there's like a narrator of the book, but it's actually multiple narrators because it's multiple generations who are going through copies. You have the first person who is traveling with Hanuvar, who's the person who wrote the initial account, and then one of his descendants went back and compiled this information. And then a third descendant of the descendant, went back and wrote notes in the margins because they feared that people wouldn't understand things. And of course, this is all kind of like in universe. Kind of like if you've read Brandon Sanderson's Frugal Wizard's Guide, a handbook for surviving medieval England. That's a mouthful. If you've read that book, you know how there's like a narrator within a narrator in that book. That's what I'm referring to. So that I think didn't work as well. It should have just had a single narrator. Like it should have just had that single person doing the notes. Having two or three is a little confusing, but it's not really confusing to the audience. You'll get it. You'll understand the story perfectly. I'm just saying, if you really want to have that more deep conversation about narration and historical narrative, maybe that wasn't the best way to do it. But that's a really small nitpick because it really is a tiny fraction of the amount of storytelling in this. So overall, I highly enjoyed this book. The second book in the series comes out in October of this year, so like 2 months later. So you can be assured book 2 is already written, turned in, and book 3 is being edited right now. So I'm very excited to read more. And I will have an interview with the author, Howard Andrew Jones, very soon. But needless to say, I loved this book. I'm going to give it like a 9.2 out of 10. Like a solid, classic feeling fantasy novel that is focused more on the plot, the characters, and the world building than it is on the magic system. And I love that. So, and it also is very much rooted in history. It's very much a historical narrative. So if you've read The Lord of a Shattered Land or are interested in it, let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.